So good morning, everyone. And I say that to the entire class. So the building in the picture, we looked at this exact same building yesterday, and I talked about how timing means a lot with fill material. This building is obviously elevated on a fill pad. If that fill pad had been created after the area was mapped into the floodplain, then this would be a building that would have to have a LOMR-F done on it, letter map revision on fill. And letters map revision on fill are done on Form MT1. So we're going to concentrate today on talking about letters map revision on fill and Form MT1. Now, this is just a quick summary of what I talked about how timing defines the fill material and gives you the Code of Federal Regulations citations that say this. And it's not in there as a definition where it would be easy for everybody to read and understand. It's in there in lawyer language for the people who review letters of map amendment, letters of map revision on fill, so they determine that fact. Now, the Form MT1 is used for LOMAs when you have a commercial property or a property in a floodway, but Form MT1 is used all the time when you are doing a letter map revision on fill. I do know some surveyors that use Form MT1 for all of their LOMAs. They don't fool around with the MTEZ. That way they never accidentally, by mistake, use the wrong form. And they've done it so many times, they're comfortable with it. And this is what the form looks like, Form MT1. Check the expiration date on the form. Like the MTEZ form commonly used for LOMAs, the MT1 form also expired in 2014. So I would recommend, if you are completing an MT1 form, that you download the forms from FEMA's website and make sure that they haven't updated the forms to a new one when you do that. I know many people who have got forms saved on their computers, but before you trot out that saved form you've got on your computer, verify on the FEMA website that it's still the current form. Oh, by the way, there's only 40 slides in today's presentation with plenty of time for questions and answers. If you have any questions, type them in the chat. I can see the chat box today. The paperwork burden disclosure notice is on the form. The MT1 form is a 4-part form, and they put the paperwork disclosure notice in every part. So you'll see the same notice about reducing paperwork 4 times, because having the same notice there 4 times reduces the paperwork, doesn't it? That's the whole point. That's my little side joke. Now, this is copied directly from the MT1 instructions, and it says, do not use this form for requests that involve changes to the base flood elevation. Because if we're changing the base flood elevation, it should be a letter map revision, because that changes the whole flood map. Requests involving changes in the floodway boundary delineations. So if you want to move the floodway from one place to another by bringing in fill, say, then you would have to do a LOMR, Form MT2. You can't do Form MT1 anymore. Next bullet talks about alluvial fans. We don't have too many of those in Kansas. You can't do a LOMR-F on an MT1 form when you put fill in the floodway. You're going to want to do the MT1 form, and that's a more complicated form. It's going to ask you for a lot more information. We don't have any V-zones in Kansas. We don't have to fool around with that too much. One of the issues I commonly have is that people put fill in a floodway, fill out the MT1 form, and then it gets rejected, and FEMA tells them you have to go and do an MT1 form. And the last 2 times it happened, the person who did it was an engineer, and you would think an engineer would know better. So, I mean, I can certainly understand a mistake happens if engineers are making that mistake. Oh, look, there's the paperwork burden disclosure notice. Now, this is the very first page of the MT1 form, and it's the property information form. There are 4 of these forms. There's a property form, a payment form, an elevation form, and a community form. You can see some boxes to check. Are you doing a LOMA? Example, if you were doing natural ground that happened to be high enough, but it was located in a floodway, you'd have to use this form. That would be a time to use it for a LOMA. A conditional Loma, that would be like you've got some high ground, you're hoping to build a house on it, but the house isn't built yet. You want to see if your plans will work out to get that house built and get a Loma later. LOMR-F, letter map revision on fill. That's what we're going to concentrate on today. So just imaginary check that box LOMR-F in your mind right now. And a LOMR-F is a conditional letter map revision on fill. So Maybe you would, as an example, you're planning to build a fill pad and put a house on it. You've applied for a permit from the Division of Water Resources office in Manhattan, Kansas, to bring fill into the floodplain. You could submit a LOMR-F with the information of your plans that you've submitted to DWR on the appropriate forms. And they could say, yes, if you build as you say you intend to build, we will approve a LOMR-F when you get done. But you still have to fill out a complete LOMR-F and pay the fees for LOMR-F when you get done. It's not an automatic process. So here's a new building, and I talked about timing. And there's a space on the form where it says, has fill been placed on the property to raise the ground previously below the BFE? And you can tell this is fill. There's no grass growing on it. It's brand new. There's brand new construction on top of it. This is recently placed fill. So this was not fill that got put in there 10 years ago before the flood maps existed. This fill was put in there just a little while before this picture was taken. And it's important to know when the fill got put in place, because there's a space on the form to ask you, when was the fill put in place? So going back to the form itself, here's what I was just reading to you from that picture. First set of boxes, check. Has fill been placed on the property to raise the ground? Yes or no? If it's yes, you're doing a LOMR-F. If no, you could be doing a LOMA. If you checked yes, when was that done? Will fill be placed on the property? That question about will fill be placed on the property is basically applies to when you are applying for a conditional letter of map revision on fill. So it's not a LOMR-F, you haven't built it yet, you intend to put fill on the property. That's when you're doing a LOMR-F. And you'll notice that there's a little asterisk next to the word yes, and it says, if yes, endangered species compliance must be documented to FEMA prior to the issuance of the LOMR-F. Now, Endangered Species Act compliance, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that later, but here's the deal. FEMA says that when there's a LOMR-F application, the fill's already put in place, and it's too late for them to have any control over the endangered species that may have been injured. But if it's a conditional letter map revision on fill, FEMA says that, well, you haven't put anything there yet. If we approve it now and they are endangered species there, then basically FEMA is partially at fault for harm to that endangered species. So they want you to provide them with proof at that time that there's no endangered species. With LOMR-F, they don't necessarily want to see the proof. They just want the local community floodplain manager to sign a form that says, I pledge on my mother's life that there was no endangered species and that my firstborn child, et cetera, et cetera. Now, street address of the property, line 1, pretty easy. Legal description of property, and it says abbreviated description from the deed. Some legal descriptions are quite lengthy, so you can use an abbreviated legal description from the deed. This is almost exactly the same things that I was asking on the MTEZ form yesterday, so I'm just going to hit the highlights of them and blast right through them because we already talked about this stuff. Are you requesting this flood zone determination be completed for 1, a building, a portion of land with a meets and bounds description, or an entire recorded legal property? One of the things that happens with LOMR-Fs is that if you imagine, go back to this one picture here, that picture. Well, on that picture, what they'd probably do is just shoot the lowest adjacent grade right next to the building. But I've had a few cases where the fill pad the building sat on was quite a bit bigger than the actual building. And they did a meets and bounds description of the top of the entire fill pad to get that out of the floodplain. So that's kind of how that works. So it could be one, it could be the other. Entire legally recorded property doesn't come up too much with LOMR-Fs, because then you'd have to put fill over every inch of ground on the property almost. What's this request for? A structure, a lot, multiple structures. This form actually has space on it to record multiple structures. Now we're going to talk about the endangered species for a while, and you're going to get sick and tired of hearing about endangered species by the time I finish this part of the class, but it is important. I hope you'll pay attention with me. So this is the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks, and they have a county by county list of all of the endangered species for that county right there on the Wildlife and Parks website. So this is a place where you can get a quick look at what endangered species and what habitats to be aware of when you're doing work in your floodplains. This is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service website out of Manhattan, Kansas. They have an office in Manhattan, Kansas. They call it their Kansas Ecological Service Office. So this Kansas field office in Manhattan will help you do an endangered species determination. And I'm going to give you some more information about that so you don't have to take tons of notes about it. There is also this place called Ipac. Basically it's an information for planning and consultation. That's the Ipac abbreviation. But if you're planning to do some work, you consult with this website and it'll spit out a letter generated to tell you about endangered species on the property. You log in or you get started. You can sign up for this website for free and get a login ID. I signed up for their website. Once you're signed up, you can draw in a location where you intend to do a project. I signed up and I did a fictional project on the 20-acre pasture that's in front of my house where we cut hay. It's just a fictional project that I made up. But I put this fake project in there and it generated a letter that told me about the endangered species that could possibly be involved. There was one of them was a species of bat, but it's a hay pasture and there are no trees. So there were no bats that were in hollow trees or up under the bark that was loose on a dead tree. So you didn't have to worry about it too much. The other species that was involved was a small fish, and that type of fish only lives in the water, you understand. And this pasture was in the floodplain, but it wasn't connected to any streams. Now here's the notes for you, and this is the part of the presentation you want to save for yourself. So if you need to find out about an endangered species, you can use Ipac. You can go to the Kansas Wildlife and Parks. But FEMA has not officially said that they will accept reviews from those outfits. They say they'll only officially accept a letter from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Now, I happen to know an engineer out of Wichita who has submitted those Ipac letters similar to the one that I was showing you with his letter map revision on fill request, and FEMA accepted it just fine. So I've got people at FEMA telling me, no, we won't accept it. And I have other people at FEMA who are accepting it. I don't know what to tell you about that. I'm just going to tell you what I was told. I also know that one person who has told me he submitted a letter from Kansas Wildlife and Parks and that was approved. But to get the official U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service office letter, it's pretty simple. You send an email to the address on the screen, kansases@fws.gov. That goes to them in Manhattan. Goes to their Kansas Ecological Services office. They will review it. In your email, put the location and what you intend to do. If you have a map, attach a map to the email. They will look it over, and if they know of any endangered species, they'll send you information back. If there are no endangered species, they'll type up a quick little letter that says there's no endangered species involved. They'll attach that letter to the email. You can print that letter off, and now you can keep a copy of that letter with your permit. You can attach a copy of the letter to the LOMR-F. Now, whose job is it to verify this? Well, the floodplain manager has to sign off that it has been verified, but I don't always think it's the floodplain manager's job to do all this homework, because the LOMR-F is being applied for by a surveyor and engineer, and engineers get paid to do that stuff. So make them do it. They're the ones that want this LOMR-F approved. I also would tell you that the Division of Water Resources has a program where when they do a fill permit, they send it to review to 7 other state agencies. One of those state agencies is the Kansas Department of Wildlife, Parks, and Tourism. This program is called the Environmental Coordination Act. DWR coordinates with other states before they approve permits. What they do is they get a permit to put fill in the floodplain. They send a copy of that permit off to these 7 agencies, and they wait 30 days for these agencies to respond. If Kansas Wildlife and Parks knows of any species, they will respond. They'll say, hey, there's this species. But sometimes when an agency doesn't see an issue, they don't send us a letter that says there's no issue. They just wait for the 30 days to run out. And that creates a delay because we have to sit there and twiddle our thumbs for 30 days before we can go through the process of approving that permit. And that keeps citizens and property owners waiting for permits to be approved. There's some talk about doing away with the Environmental Coordination Act. That might save time on getting permits approved, but it will also take away one step to help ensure that we don't run into any hiccups with endangered species because we're no longer getting that review. And it would then become basically the responsibility of the citizens to go and talk to the Kansas Forestry Service and to go and talk to the State Hazard Preservation Officer about historical and Indian burial grounds. I had an Indian burial ground in one of mine once. So it's good and bad that they're going to do away with that. But as it pertains to the Endangered Species Act, it could be kind of be a problem. The Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks review of endangered species is actually more critical than the review done by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So if U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, if Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks doesn't find anything, it's pretty safe bet U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service won't. That's because there might be some species of bird that is endangered in Kansas, but it might be common somewhere east of the Mississippi River. So it's not considered critically endangered because they might be abundant somewhere else, even though they're very, very rare and uncommon in Kansas. So there's a whole lot of stuff to talk about there with the Endangered Species Act. What's going on is that FEMA got into lawsuits over the Endangered Species Act. They were actually sued by another branch of the federal government. So the Fish and Wildlife Service was taking FEMA to court over endangered species. And it all started with salmon up in Washington state. They were doing floodplain fills and LOMRs on rivers in Washington where salmon would spawn. So the Fish and Wildlife Service was suing FEMA over that. And FEMA got tired of being taken to court over and over again because then it started happening with key deer in the Florida Everglades, and it happened in New Mexico and Colorado, and it just was like a snowball. So FEMA decided that we're going to require local communities to be in charge of endangered species. That way we won't get yelled at anymore, and the local communities, guys like you, Tony, can get taken to court over it all. Isn't that good of FEMA? They actually changed the LOMR-F form. There was a lot more stuff on the LOMR-F form after 2010 about endangered species than there was before. And that was a direct result of those lawsuits. Well, you get this far down on the form, it says, please complete this checklist, and it gives you a checklist. And doesn't this checklist look similar to the one on the MTEZ form that we talked about yesterday? You need a copy of the FIRM, which is a panel, a FIRMET mini map. We talked about how to make those yesterday, so everybody knows how. A copy of the property deed, and that's going to have that full legal description that we might have had to abbreviate. You're also going to need your elevation form. We need a form that says how high the ground is, because you can't approve a LOMR-F if you don't know if it's elevated to the proper level. You'll need a scale bar north arrow, any maps submitted. And then for LOMR-Fs, you're also going to need Form 3, the Community Acknowledgement Form. I'll spend a little time talking about that. And it also talks about ESA compliance must be documented. How do you document that? Well, one form of documentation would be a letter from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It says that FEMA encourages submission of all required data in a digital format. To submit it in digital format, you can use FEMA's online LOMC Submittal website. And Cheyenne can send out a little handout about how to get that. We have a handout about the online Submittal website. But during the virus, there have been delays in getting mail-in documents approved. I'm not even sure that the mailroom staff are working 100% of the time. For a while, they were not. The other issue is that if you send it in paper copies in an envelope in the mail, somebody has to take it out of that envelope and scan it and then forward it digitally to an engineer. And they charge you an extra $100 for reviewing that and scanning it before they send it to the engineer. So it's cheaper to do them online, digital format submitted through their website. Here's the fee structure. A LOMR-F is, okay, multiple structures, $800. LOMR-F, $425, but it's $525 if you send it by postal mail. I'll just tell you right now. And the CLOMA and LOMR-F, right there in the middle, $500 for CLOMA. CLOMA costs $500, but LOMAs are fee exempt, which it says fourth line down from the top. So a lot of times people don't do CLOMAs. They just wait and do a LOMA when the project's done. Always give them an email address It makes it handy to make a quick correction if there's some minor little mistake on the paperwork you've submitted. If you don't do that, then you have to wait for them to mail you a letter, and that's going to cause delays. Another issue we have is that people submit LOMR-Fs that are being rejected by FEMA. These are surveyors, engineers who are submitting these. So we're going to talk a little bit about what not to do right now. This is a handout, a document from FEMA, Technical Bulletin 10-01. This technical bulletin tells you how to build a building in a floodplain on fill with a basement that will be reasonably safe from flooding. And if you follow the guidance in the document and you build a building exactly the way that's shown in the picture that's in the document that's on the right-hand side of the screen right now, FEMA will reject your LOMR-F, and they will notify the regional office of FEMA in Kansas City, Missouri, that your community has violations. That is the truth. Now, one of the people that's on my call today is Tony from Derby. Tony, you have a residential basement exemption program in Derby. So what I said may not be 100% accurate for Derby, but it's true in every other community in Kansas that doesn't have that exemption. And there's only 10 communities in Kansas that have that exemption, you see. And this one in the picture would probably not meet the requirements of that exemption for residential basement floodproofing, because from the top of the fill pad to the bottom of the floor is much more than 5 feet. So that puts this floor of this basement roughly 8 feet below grade. And your basement exemption only allows them to be, I want to say about 3 feet below grade. They can't be more than 5 feet below the BFE for one thing. Now, here are some pictures from a FEMA book on how to review letters of map revision. And it has these exact pictures were shown yesterday, but the application is different here. Lowest adjacent grade is the bottom of this window well, or it's the bottom of this truck ramp. And if the lowest adjacent grade is below the BFE on a LOMA, you can submit documents to say there's intervening higher ground. And FEMA will say, yep, there was intervening natural grade, higher ground. We should have accounted for that in our map. Our map was wrong, and they'll approve it. If you bring in fill dirt, you're trying to change the conditions of the flood map. So they're saying our map was right the whole time. You're altering the conditions and putting something in the floodplain that's at risk. And we have to evaluate the risk. And our evaluation of the risk is that the lowest adjacent grade is below the BFE, and they won't approve a LOMR-F. So what can be approved on a LOMA with natural ground could look exactly the same as a building that's on fill, but one would be approved and one won't be. And that's where I've had engineers and surveyors making mistakes, submit documents. I've had the other problem I've had, well, we'll get into that in just a minute. Let's go to the next picture. Here's some real life case examples. This is a John Deere dealership, has this truck ramp that goes down below grade. There's intervening at the bottom edge of the picture right there, intervening high ground where the ramp meets the existing grade. But for a LOMR-F, they would ignore that completely and look to see if what's at the bottom of that truck ramp is below BFE or not. There's a window well off to the side, and then there's one of those little walkout basement doors where you walk out, you're on a sort of a little patio and you go up some steps to get to ground level. Because that's below grade on all 4 sides, they're not going to take into account the bricks or the dirt around the outside of it. You can see the bottom of that patio down there, the surface of that patio that you step on outside that door is the lowest adjacent grade. And if that's below the flood elevation, you would not get a LOMR-F for this. For a LOMA, they would look at the grassed in dirt around the outside of that brick probably, and it might be approved. Another situation I've had was property had crawl space. Building was raised on a crawl space. They piled dirt around the outside of the foundation. Then they tried to get a LOMR-F by saying that the dirt they'd piled around the outside of the basin made it a building elevate on fill. Well, the inside of that basement, or the inside of that crawl space, was above grade before they piled dirt around it. When they piled the dirt around the outside, the interior of the crawl space was now below grade on all 4 sides. By definition, it was no longer a crawl space, it was a basement. The community's floodplain regulations did not allow basements in the floodplain below grade, with the floor of the basement below grade. So then FEMA's reviewers notified FEMA in Kansas City and said, hey, this community's got a violation in their community. We're not going to approve the LOMR-F. We're going to support your enforcement of the violation. And then FEMA in Kansas City called me, told me to go fix it. And those aren't always easy to fix. Now, okay, going on to the form. This form is fairly simple. Applicant's name, mailing address, daytime phone number, okay? This should be pretty simple to fill out. And that pretty much completes Form 1, the property form. Now we're going to go on to Form 2, the elevation form. And the elevation will include attached deck or garage. That's not used on elevation certificates for insurance rating. There's a line on the form C2H where they ask you for that information, but they don't use it for much of anything. The reason it's there is in case somebody submits an elevation certificate as a supporting document for a LOMA or a LOMR-F. Notice there's the paperwork burden disclosure notice again. Okay, the NFIP community number, we know how to get that. It's on the flood maps. It's also found in the FEMA community status book. FEMA community status book looks like this. You can do a Google search for FEMA community status book. So you just go to like Bing or your favorite search engine, and type in FEMA community status book, it brings it up, and it has different sections. There's a section for each state. So you'll usually have to go to the second page of that list to find Kansas. Then you click on Kansas, it opens up, you'll see an alphabetical listing of all of the cities in Kansas. So then you can find your community, and the first column, CID, is the community identification number, which goes on the form right here. You'll also find that same information on the flood maps. Property name and address is easy. So, are the elevations below listed on existing or proposed conditions? If it's proposed, it's a LOMR-F. If it's existing, it's a LOMR-F. If you do a LOMR-F now, you have to do a LOMR-F later anyway. Just be aware of that. Let's go back and look at this form a little bit. Is the existing building a crawl space, a basement, slab on grade? You'll have to check the box. Has FEMA identified this area as land subsidence? Nobody who's on the call today has any of that. What elevation datum was used? So we have some older flood maps made in 1929 datum, made to the 1929 datum. But after 1988, they started promoting the use of the North American vertical datum of 1988, but we didn't always get new flood maps that incorporated that data until well into the 21st century. So any maps made in the 1990s are probably still done to NGVD, but anything pretty much made after 2005 is pretty much made to NAVD. But to find out what the maps were made to, you need to open up the maps, read the FIS, or look on the index page of the firm of the map, look in the map notes of the panel that you're working on. There are various places to find it. The reason that's important is you don't want to use a benchmark that was in 1929 datum and have part of your form filled out to one set of datum, but your maps are in 1988 datum, because then you're comparing apples to oranges. Please indicate the latitude and longitude of the upstream edge of the structure, the building, and the upstream edge of the property. We talked about that yesterday. So if you can do the MTEZ form, you're almost gold with the MT1 form. Okay, then it asks you for the lowest lot elevation, and I drew your attention to the notes at the bottom. For requests involving a portion of a property, include the lowest ground elevation with a meets and bounds description. So you could put in a big fill pad. Have the top of it be a big flat area, maybe a 1/4 acre in size. Drew a meets and bounds description, get the whole top of your fill pad out of the floodplain. And then in the future, if you come back to build, anything you build on top of that fill pad is out of the floodplain. We don't necessarily have to wait till the building's built and just do a lowest adjacent grade next to the building, although that's an option. This form is going to ask you for the base foot elevation and the source of the base foot elevation. We kind of went through that yesterday. It's pretty much exactly the same method. Lot number, block number, address number. We don't usually have too many problems with this part of the page. Now, the second page of the elevation form is where you can list multiple properties. So you can list a whole bunch of different properties on here. Now, the building in the photograph is kind of interesting. This one is from Derby, Kansas, and it's elevated on a fill pad. And the fill pad is goes in a circle around 2.5 sides of the fill pad. There's a retaining wall. Well, that's a retaining wall. That's not foundation of the building. You'll notice that there's stairs going up to the door of this single wide manufactured home. And you'll notice the siding is a different color below the stairs at that level and below the other door that doesn't have any stairs to it. That's the siding. That's the skirting around the manufactured homes. That's not actually foundation walls or anything of the kind. This is a mobile home, and inside that skirting, the manufactured home is elevated on piers or posts. And it has skirting around the outside of it. The whole thing is sitting on top of a fill pad. The fill pad has a retaining wall that goes around half of the front, one end, and the back side, but the other 1.5 sides are a ramp, which was how they got that thing driven up there on top of that fill pad in the beginning. So this would be a LOMR-F, and they could have done a LOMR-F to say the whole top of this pad is out, or they could have done lowest adjacent grade and checked to see what the elevation was roughly at the point where the skirting meets the ground. But because it includes adjacent deck or stairs, I would have done it at the bottom of the stair steps near the right-hand side of the picture, because that looks like the low point. The community form. So this is the third form. This is the community acknowledgement form. So for floodplain managers who are community officials, this is a very important form to pay attention to, because you'll be asked to sign this at some point. So whether you ever think you're going to be involved in a LOMR-F or not, somebody may put this form in front of you and ask you to sign it. Again, we have the paperwork burden disclosure notice. Now on the form, that's going to ask you for the community number and the property address. That's fairly simple. The thing that I want to put note to is where I've written at the bottom, important. Read all of the instructions on this form before you sign it. Don't just say, yeah, it'll be okay, and sign it. So here are those instructions, and I've underlined a few things. Based upon the community's review, I'm reading out loud to you now, we find the completed or proposed project meets or is designed to meet all of the community floodplain management requirements. So if they're proposing a project involving this LOMR-F that doesn't meet your floodplain management regulations, you cannot sign this form. So it's common practice where people will put a fill pad in the floodplain, and then they have the intention of digging a basement right down through the middle of that fill pad and putting a building in with a basement in the floodplain with the floor of the basement well below BFE. Okay, your regulations don't allow basement floors to be below BFE in the floodplain. So that's a proposed project that doesn't meet your regulations. And if that's their intention, do not sign this form. I know a community official who he wrote on the form in community comments, you may not put in a basement on this form. I am signing it on the condition that you'll build a slab on grade building. And after the LOMR-F was approved, the property owner hired an attorney to dispute it with the community. And they said, hey, your comments here are not legally binding on us, and we're building a building with a basement. So my recommendation to you is, if there's any kind of issue like that, don't sign the form at all. Make them accept a covenant on the deed that says it's not allowed. That's more legally binding. I've also underlined the statement that includes the part about regulatory floodways. So, including the requirement that no fill be placed in the regulatory floodway. If there's any fill placed in the regulatory floodway, don't sign this form, because it's the wrong form. They needed to do the much longer MT2 form. I've had engineers try to get by with doing the MT1 form because it's shorter and easier than doing the work of the MT2 form. So they use the wrong form on purpose because it looks easier, but it just wastes everybody's time when FEMA rejects it. And it makes us look bad as floodplain managers if we've signed off an agreement on a form that said there's no fill in the floodway when there's clearly fill in the floodway. Verify that all necessary state and federal permits have been issued. So that would include your Division of Water Resources permits and your local floodplain permits. So situations happen where people sometimes bring in fill and they put it in the floodplain and they don't get a permit. And then they get a LOMR-F from FEMA. And then you try and say, well, I never gave you a permit to put that fill in the floodplain. You have to have a fill permit from me. And they say, well, I already got a LOMR-F from FEMA. And then you say, oh, how'd you get it? Because I never signed a community form. That's happened twice. Guess what? There was a signature on a community form, but it wasn't my floodplain manager's signature. That's interesting stories. Okay, now, then I've underlined the part about endangered species again, because we're going to hit that Endangered Species Act thing again. They are making you sign a form right here that says the applicant will document Endangered Species Act compliance to FEMA. Do you have that documentation? FEMA can ask local community floodplain managers to produce Endangered Species Act documentation associated with floodplain permits at any time. According to FEMA, that's what they say. So I don't want you to fool around with that Endangered Species Act stuff. Take the time to get it verified. I also underlined the part about reasonably safe. Now, our definition from reasonably safe, it reads something along the lines of it's reasonably safe from both surface and subsurface waters. So if the top of the fill pad is a foot above the base flood elevation, and I've got a slab on grade home on top of that, that's pretty safe from surface waters associated with a 1% annual chance flood. But if they have a fill pad and they intend to put a basement in it, and the floor of the basement's going to be below the BFE, subsurface waters below the ground soaking into the soil of that fill pad can put hydraulic pressure, hydrodynamic forces against the walls of that basement that's in there. So that's not reasonably safe. I have had community officials, and I support this when they ask me if they can do it. They say, I'm not comfortable making a decision that this building is reasonably safe from flooding. I'm not an engineer. And then I just tell them, well, tell them you won't sign it until the engineer that's doing their LOMR-F for you gives you a letter that says it's reasonably safe from flooding. And then they keep that letter on file and they sign this form. I have some small town city clerks that have no construction experience and they just don't feel safe making that call on their own. Now, 44 CFR 65.5 Section 4 says what a community must assure. This is the short version. You can read it directly out of the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 44 on Emergency Management, Section 65.5. And it has a long list of things that the community must assure when signing off on this form. But I've hit the points that are the most important. No fill in the floodway. Endangered Species Act must be verified. All state and federal permits, and that would include taking of endangered species, consider that as being like a permit. All projects that they intend to do in association with this LOMR-F must meet your floodplain management requirements before you sign the LOMR-F. Once you sign the LOMR-F documentation, this community form, and FEMA approves it, it's too late to go back and say, hey, you're not in compliance with our floodplain regulations, because your floodplain regulations only apply in the map floodplain, and you've given them permission to take this out of the floodplain and do it wrong. Now, current or proposed projects, regulatory floodway, reasonably safe, bold print, all the stuff that I just broke down and covered for you, and the definition of reasonably safe. So I've given you the notes here of what I just said, so you didn't have to write all that stuff down because I know I talk kind of fast. Now, this actual case from Kansas. This one was in South Central Kansas, and they had a deal where had a wooden porch. They tore that wooden porch off, and they put a raised slab. So you built stem walls, filled it in with dirt to level it up, and then you pour a slab on top. So now instead of a wooden porch, we've got something that looks a little bit from the outside like a retaining wall with a slab on it. But they also put dirt against the crawl space foundation around two other sides of the building to get all of the adjacent grade above the base flood elevation. But by doing that, the crawl space went from being a crawl space where the floor of the crawl space was equal to the outside grade. The crawl space is now a basement because the interior of the crawl space is below that dirt that they piled around the outside of it on all three sides, or all four sides, excuse me. So don't do these projects. And if you're unsure if a project is appropriate, you call me. Send me some pictures. Have your surveyors call me. I have surveyors that call me a lot when they're doing a retrofit, and that's really what this is. Somebody's trying to retrofit the grade to get out of buying flood insurance. And I want people to have flood insurance. I don't want them to overpay for it necessarily, but it just wastes everybody's time and money to submit a document that you know is going to get rejected. And a lot of times if they had called me, I said, FEMA would never approve that, and I would have told them in advance, and it would have saved them all the time. Okay, property within the regulatory floodway. So we have an extra box on the community form for property within a regulatory floodway. But this applies to when you're applying for LOMA. Remember I said that the MT1 form is used when applying for letter map amendment in the floodway. So that's when this form comes into play. So this is part B of the community form. We just looked at part A of the community form. This is part B. Part A, part B. It's all one page. And they want you to sign it. You're putting your neck on the line. You're signing this form. If you're not sure how to find a floodway, it's the diagonal striped area. All right. Then there's the payment form. There is no payment when it's a LOMA. So even if it's your LOMA's in the floodway, it's still a LOMA and there's no payment fee for LOMA. But if you're doing anything except a simple LOMA, you need to go back to that payment schedule and see how much you need to pay. And then this is just the payment form. Remember what I said, costs extra to submit by postal mail. So it's cheaper and easier to submit them electronically online, and it gets a faster review and approval, and we all want that. Here's how to submit them online. And it's FEMA.gov/online-LOMC. That's the website. You go right there, and there's an online submittal form. And the online submittal form says stuff like, what's the map number? What's the community number? What's the base flood elevation? What's your name and address? And you just go through these tabs, fill out the information, then you attach your completed MT1 form, your ferment map, your property deed, your elevations that were done, anything else that you've got, like a GIS map with a scale bar and north arrow, and your letter from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service saying there's no endangered species, and your DWR permit, and you attach all those documents and you hit submit. That's a little bit quick an overview of how it worked. I submitted a fake project on this website, and I took it all the way to the last page, and then I didn't hit submit just so I could go through it, see how it worked. And for about 3 years, FEMA kept sending me emails saying, hey, we've got your project open, but you haven't completed it yet. All right, what is U.S. Code Section 101? This is the U.S. Criminal Code, and this is what it reads. And basically, it says if you knowingly submit false information to a federal agency, you could be held accountable under the U.S. Criminal Code. So think about that before you sign a community form. Now, you can make a mistake. An honest mistake is an honest mistake. So if you miscalculate a BFE by 1/10 of a foot, that's an honest mistake. All right. If you've got a letter from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that says there's endangered species on the property, but you sign the form that there are no endangered species, then you've knowingly violated the law. I don't think any of my floodplain, I don't think any of the floodplain managers on this call today would knowingly violate the law. I'll say that much. Okay. This is hard stuff, and I'm not trying to be a jerk about it, but I want you to be aware of what you're signing for, that community form. And if you ever have a problem and you've got a community form in front of you and you're not sure about it, you give me a call, and that's my phone number right there, 1-785-296-4622. Don Masterson works for FEMA. He's assigned to the state of Kansas. He's our Kansas specialist for FEMA Region 7. His office in Kansas City, Missouri. If you call Don, he can give you my phone number. If you need flood maps, you need to make a ferment mini map, you can go to the Map Service Center at msc.fema.gov. FEMA has some good books out there. They actually have some stuff on how to do letters of map revision on fill, that kind of thing. There's a whole library, a FEMA library, and you can order books from the FEMA library by calling their distribution office at the 800-480-2520. Cheyenne and I have a whole bunch of books in our storeroom, and we order those from the FEMA library so that we can pass them out to people. I wish we were meeting in person today instead of digitally, and I'd bring books to class. FEMA put the NGS phone number on their flood maps so that surveyors and engineers can call the NGS with questions about benchmarks used for elevation surveys. Floodsmart.gov is a good website. It used to be a better website. It was taken down for a while over a contract dispute about the rights to the name floodsmart.gov. And that's a long story. I'll tell it sometime over a beer, but they've got the website back up now. They're starting to build it up, and it's nearly as good as it used to be now. I recommend surveyors and engineers get to know their local floodplain managers, and I recommend that local floodplain managers get to know their surveyors and engineers. I have a floodplain manager in a town about an hour west of Topeka. I won't tell you the name of the town, but he hosted an elevation certificate class in his building. And he invited every surveyor in his area to come to the class. And he told them they didn't have to come to the class, but when the class was over, he was going to make a list of all of the surveyors who attended the class. And then when a citizen asks him, hey, can you recommend a surveyor for me to hire? He said, I can't recommend a surveyor, but I have a list here of surveyors who attended a class about how to fill that form out correctly. And that's what he does. So he was sort of offering them a carrot and a stick situation. You can attend this class, learn how to do elevation certificates, and your name can go on this list, or you can not attend the class. The Army Corps of Engineers, the phone number down there, that's to request a base flood elevation through the Army Corps of Engineers. We talked about that briefly yesterday. And we have a handout about how to contact the Army Corps of Engineers if anybody wants to see it. Just get with Cheyenne. Now, you can learn even more. FEMA has independent study courses on the internet. So there's an outfit called the Emergency Management Institute. They have a website, and they have classes posted on their website. And the independent study classes have code IS at the beginning of them. So IS 119 is a class on letters of map amendment and LOMR-Fs. The class has 150 slides in it that you tab through. Our class this morning had roughly 40 slides, and our class yesterday morning had roughly 60 slides. So this FEMA class has more in-depth information on certain topics. When you take the class, you will need to sign up for a student ID number. And if you see the red box at the left, you click that icon. It takes you to the section of their website where you can sign up to get a student identification number. Then you will use that student identification number every time you sign up for a class, and the federal government will keep track of classes you've taken. You take the class, you tab through, you read the slides. When you get to the end, there's a test you have to take, and it's a multiple choice test. You take the multiple choice test, and if you pass the test, it spits out a certificate that looks like the one in the lower right. There are so many good classes on this website that I recommend that floodplain managers, when they have time to do some independent study, if you've got 3 or 4 hours where you're going to be in the office without any urgent projects, this is a great way to learn about things. One of the other good classes is the one on substantial damage and substantial improvement. The MT1 form has several pages of instructions, and I recommend that you read the instructions before you ever fill out your first MT1 if you're a surveyor or engineer. And I recommend that communities read the MT1 instructions, especially the section of the instructions on the community form before you sign it. If you have any questions about what we went over in class today, you can contact these two people. I used the wrong font size and I didn't have much room. So if you can't read the little name at the bottom, just contact Cheyenne. And for the nearsighted people, there's my name and phone number. All right. So I think that pretty well concludes it. I'm going to stop sharing. Well, I'm going to leave the share screen up. Do any of the many students in class today have any questions?
Thank you, Steve.
Sure thing, Tony.
I find most of my questions end up off the time that I'm going through the process, as you well know from the many conversations we've had over
Sure.
the months.
Sure. For Cheyenne's benefit, who doesn't know, and the rest of the class, Tony is dealing with a subdivision issue. And there are multiple issues involved. There is fill in the subdivision, but the original issue was when they start off with a subdivision that was going to be 4 lots. So it's platted as 4 lots, might have been 6, I don't remember, but they went back later and decided to replat it, add additional lots, but the additional lots they added were not listed on the LOMR documentation that they had approved. So we recommended that you go back and fill out new forms, and then that led into more glitches and more glitches. That's a fair assumption, Tony, without me giving away too many details.
Yep, that'll work.
And that one's been one of those real life learning experiences. Is that fair to say?
That is completely fair to say, Steve.
Yeah, and you would have rather learned all that stuff in a class from me than in real life, wouldn't you?
It sticks more. When you're
Yeah, yeah, it does stick more when it's in real life. All right. So does anybody else in class have any questions? So I'm not seeing any in the chat. So Cheyenne, I guess